John came home from Hamburg in the new year, but in February he set off on the Beatles' first national tour, backing Helen Shapiro, which gave them the opportunity to introduce themselves to a wider audience. John required a lot of reassurance before he left, but he needn't have worried. Audiences everywhere loved the Beatles. They were so successful that they regularly stole the show. John rang me from whichever hotel they were staying in. Even though he was enjoying the gigs because audiences loved them, he was missing me. The tour company spent long hours crisscrossing the country on a coach, and John whiled away the time reading, composing, having impromptu jamming sessions, or taking the mickey out of Helen, who, despite her star status, was completely in awe of him. Later she said that although John teased her mercilessly, he was also kind and protective. Please Please Me was released in mid-January and reached number 1 in the charts on February the 16th, while the boys were still on tour. When John phoned to tell me, I screamed with delight. They'd made it to the top of the hit parade, and at that point I felt things couldn't get any better. John was due home a few days later, and, keen to look as good as I could for him, I decided to get my hair done. Unfortunately, I let the hairdresser talk me into having it cut to shoulder length. When I saw it, I was horrified, and I knew John would hate it. My hair was one of the things he loved best about me. I spent the evening wondering what to do. At night I put my hair in rollers, so that when he came in late, he couldn't see what had happened. But the next morning there was no hiding it. I had known he wouldn't like it, but I wasn't prepared for just how angry he would be. He looked at me with hatred and screamed, "What have you done?" Then he refused to talk to me or even look at me for 2 days. It was awful. I preferred him shouting to the furious silence. Thankfully, on the 3rd day, he thawed, put his arms round me and apologized. I never contemplated having my hair cut so radically again. On Saturday, April the 6th, John was away on yet another trip, so Phil came over and we decided to go shopping in Penny Lane. I was sick of feeling huge and decided to buy myself something pretty to wear after the birth. Halfway through the afternoon, the contractions began. "I think this could be it," I told Phil, but they weren't severe and I'd had plenty of false ones before, so I decided to wait and see. We went home and I put my feet up. Phil made us something to eat and promised to stay with me. By late evening, nothing much had happened, so we went to bed. At 4 in the morning, I was woken by a surge of pain that took my breath away. I screamed, and Phil, shocked awake and trying not to panic, phoned for an ambulance. It arrived so promptly that we were both still in our nighties, and Phil's hair was in curlers. She grabbed a coat, rolled up her nightie under it, and put a scarf over her rollers. I was helped out to the ambulance, and she followed with the bag I'd packed, a rather large suitcase. It was far too big for the few items I was taking with me, but it was all I had. When we arrived at the hospital, I was wheeled away, and Phil was handed back the case, minus my things. She was told that she was no longer needed and might as well go home and get some sleep. The only problem was that she was in her nightclothes with no money. She had hoped the ambulance might drop her back at Mimi's, but was told firmly that it wouldn't. Poor Phil started to walk the couple of miles back from Sefton General Hospital to Mimi's, freezing cold and lugging my case. Luckily for her, a kind-hearted taxi driver stopped, thinking she was a runaway. He told her not to be too hasty and offered to take her home for free. Phil was too tired to explain, but accepted gratefully. When she arrived at Mimi's, she fell into bed. Mimi must have heard the disturbance during the night, but she hadn't appeared, and Phil saw no sign of her until at 6 the next morning she began vacuuming outside Phil's bedroom door. It was how she liked to indicate to me that she considered it time for me to get up, and Sunday mornings were no exception. Exhausted, Phil got her things together and went home. Throughout that Sunday I was in labour and feeling horribly alone. John had phoned often over the last few days, and I knew Mimi would tell him I'd gone into the hospital when he called again. But it hadn't occurred to me that he should be at the birth. Having fathers present for the birth just wasn't the custom then. The person I wanted was my mum, but she was still in Canada, so I had to go through the birth alone. In the early hours of Monday morning, April the 8th, I was taken into the delivery room and told that I was ready to give birth. It was an Afro-Caribbean midwife who told me firmly that if I didn't get on with it, my baby would die and so would I. Terrified, I rallied every last ounce of strength and pushed my baby into the world at 6:50 a.m. Our son arrived with the cord around his neck and yellow with jaundice. So the midwife whisked him away. I was cleaned up and moved back to a bed in the ward. A short while later he was put into my arms, and I looked down at him for the first time. He was tiny, his small face scrunched up and bright red. I thought he was absolutely perfect. He was put into a cot beside me, and we both slept, exhausted from the long hours of labour. The next day Mimi finally turned up. She had phoned and had been told the baby had arrived and came to inspect John's son. She was as stiff as ever with me, but when she looked at the baby, her face softened. She had already phoned John to tell him he was a father, and she offered to send my mother a telegram. I thanked her and told her I would write to her myself. I was glad John knew, but disappointed not to have told him myself. John didn't make it to the hospital until 3 days after our son was born. The first opportunity he'd had to get away from the tour, he came in like a whirlwind, racing through the doors in his haste to find us. He kissed me, then looked at his son, who was in my arms. There were tears in his eyes. "Cyn, he's bloody marvellous, he's fantastic." He sat on the bed and I put the baby into his arms. He held each tiny hand, marvelling at the miniature fingers, and a big smile spread over his face. "Who's going to be a famous little rocker like his dad then?" he said. John arranged for me to be moved into a private room. He knew that both he and I might attract unwelcome attention if I stayed in the public ward. It was wonderful to see him, but privacy was impossible. My room had a window onto the corridor outside, and when word got out that he was there, dozens of patients and staff gathered with their noses pressed to the window. The room felt like a goldfish bowl, and it was obvious John couldn't stay long. He hugged me and signed dozens of autographs on his way out. I was disappointed that we'd had so little time together. He had to go straight back to the tour and wouldn't be home again for a week or so. John's visit was brief, but it had a dramatic effect. The nurses were distinctly friendlier to me than they had been when I first arrived. A couple of days later, the baby and I went home from the hospital in a taxi. Both John and I wanted to give our son family names, so we called him John after his father. I suggested Julian because it was as close as we could get to John's mother's name, and we chose Charles after my father. So John, Charles, Julian Lennon, to be known as Julian. John had a moment's worry about whether Julian was too sissy a name, but decided to forget it. We both liked the name, and he wanted it in memory of Julia. So that was settled.